a small, picturesque village nestled between rolling hills, there lived a young woman named Kolochoko. The village, though charming and close-knit, had a quiet undercurrent of gossip and hidden secrets. Kolochoko, at 19, was a girl of delicate beauty, her face framed by dark hair that cascaded like silk, but her heart was soft and vulnerable, making her an easy target for manipulation. She had inherited her mother's kindness, but unlike her mother, Kolochoko did not possess the same strength to stand up for herself. Since her mother's untimely death when Kolochoko was just a child, the girl had been under the strict rule of her stepmother, Agnes. Agnes was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who crossed her path. She had married Kolochoko's father, Harold, a prosperous merchant in the village, under the pretense of love, but in truth, Agnes was driven solely by her thirst for power and wealth. When Harold's health began to decline, weakening both his body and mind, Agnes saw an opportunity to solidify her grip on the family fortune. Kolochoko's father, once a strong and influential figure in the village, had been bedridden for months due to a lingering illness that rendered him unable to manage the family's estate. As his body withered away, his mind became clouded, and his once sharp judgment faltered. Agnes, taking advantage of his vulnerability, manipulated him into leaving all decisions regarding the family's wealth and future to her. She convinced him that Kolochoko was too young and naive to handle such responsibility, and that Agnes alone could protect the family's legacy. What Agnes failed to account for was Kolochoko's intelligence and her strong sense of justice. Though sheltered and naive, Kolochoko was not blind to her stepmother's true nature. She had witnessed the coldness in Agnes's eyes when Harold was too weak to defend himself, and she often overheard hushed conversations where Agnes spoke of securing their wealth, but only for herself. Kolochoko had learned early on that her stepmother would stop at nothing to ensure her own prosperity. As Kolochoko matured, the burden of Agnes's control became more suffocating. Agnes, knowing that her husband's fortune would soon be passed on to Kolochoko, devised a cunning plan to marry the girl off to Elliot, the poor, hard-working son of a local farmer. Elliot was an honest man, respected in the village for his diligence, but he had nothing to offer in terms of wealth. Agnes's reasoning for this match was simple. By marrying Kolochoko to someone without money or land, she could ensure that Kolochoko would never have the resources to claim her inheritance. Agnes was well aware that Kolochoko's future was tied to her father's fortune, and she intended to have full control over that. Kolochoko, however, had no interest in marrying Elliot, or any man for that matter. She was not blinded by the idea of love or romance, as Agnes was. Instead, she was acutely aware of the social expectations and the pressure her stepmother had placed on her to secure her future, even if it meant giving up her own hopes and dreams. To Kolochoko, marriage to Elliot symbolized the life of servitude and misery that Agnes intended to trap her in. But Elliot, despite his humble background, was a kind soul, known for his quiet strength and dedication to his family. He had always admired Kolochoko from afar, unaware of the cruel game that was being played around them. His father had often spoken of him marrying well to improve their status, and though Elliot was not interested in wealth, the idea of a union with someone like Kolochoko seemed a dream come true, until Agnes's manipulative schemes began to shape his future. The tension in the village was palpable. Agnes's plot was still in its early stages, but it was clear that Kolochoko's life was being decided for her, without her consent. And while she was not yet aware of the full extent of her stepmother's machinations, Kolochoko could feel the weight of her impending fate. In her heart, she knew that she had no say in the matter, and that every decision made for her was one that would shape her future, and possibly lead to her undoing. The days in the house grew heavier as Agnes tightened her grip on Kolochoko. Her stepmother's scheme had begun to take shape. Each carefully laid step, bringing Kolochoko closer to a fate she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Agnes, knowing that time was running out with Harold's health in a continuous decline, began to apply subtle pressure on Kolochoko to consider marriage to Elliot. She spoke of him often, weaving his name into conversation as though it were the only option for Kolochoko's future. "Don't be foolish, Kolochoko," Agnes would say with a gentle but firm tone. "Elliot may not have wealth, but he is a decent, hard-working man. If you marry him, you'll never have to worry about the struggles I've had. You can live peacefully with someone who understands what it means to work hard for a living." But Kolochoko saw through the layers of Agnes's words. She knew that Agnes didn't care for Elliot's kindness or his hard-working nature. It was his poverty that Agnes had her sights on. To her stepmother, marrying Kolochoko off to Elliot was a way to ensure that the family fortune would remain under her control. Agnes was fully aware that Harold's inheritance was meant for Kolochoko upon his death, and by marrying her to someone who had nothing, Kolochoko would be left powerless, unable to claim what was rightfully hers. Kolochoko, however, couldn't ignore the unease that simmered within her. She was resistant to the idea of marrying Elliot, not out of any fault of his, but because of what he represented: poverty, struggle, and a life of hardship. To her, Elliot was not a suitor she had chosen. He was a symbol of the life she feared most, a life where dreams and ambition faded into the bleakness of survival. "Why must you keep pushing me to marry him?" Kolochoko asked one evening, her voice tinged with frustration as she gazed at her stepmother, who was seated across from her by the hearth. "I don't want a life like his. I want more. I deserve more." Agnes, ever calm and composed, placed her hand on Kolochoko's, her smile cold but comforting. "My dear, you are still so young. You cannot see what I see. You are the last of the family line. If you refuse this marriage, you will end up alone and destitute, with no one to take care of you. Marrying Elliot is the only way to ensure your future is secure." The insinuation of destitution was always there in Agnes's words, hanging in the air like a dark cloud, making it seem as if Kolochoko had no other choice. Agnes knew exactly how to manipulate her, preying on her fears and insecurities. Kolochoko had seen how quickly her father's wealth had begun to slip away, how slowly the estate had been deteriorating in his absence. She had also witnessed how Agnes had begun to take over everything, from decisions about the household to overseeing the staff. Kolochoko wasn't blind to the manipulation. She understood that Agnes had been positioning her to take control of the family's assets after Harold's passing, and that this marriage to Elliot was part of that grand plan. But Kolochoko wasn't ready to accept that truth. She wasn't ready to give up her autonomy. Despite the growing unease, Kolochoko resisted the idea of marrying Elliot. Every time Agnes brought it up, she would distance herself, retreating into her own thoughts. She found solace in long walks through the village, away from the tension in the house where she could think clearly. There, she saw the simple but meaningful lives of the villagers, particularly Elliot's family. Elliot's mother, Martha, always greeted her with kindness when she passed by their humble farm. Yet, every time she saw him, standing in the fields, with his rough hands and simple clothes, Kolochoko felt a pang of discomfort. She knew that despite his gentleness, their worlds were vastly different. But Agnes didn't stop. She had a methodical way of wearing down her stepdaughter's resistance, isolating her emotionally until she felt there were no other options. Kolochoko's father, now frail and nearly unable to speak, could no longer provide any defense against Agnes's manipulations. He would simply nod weakly when Agnes would suggest things, unable to even understand the true consequences of her actions. As the days passed, Agnes continued her emotional warfare. She would subtly isolate Kolochoko from her friends in the village, speaking ill of their families, making the young woman feel that no one cared for her or understood her. Agnes planted seeds of doubt in Kolochoko's mind, constantly reminding her of the dangers of loneliness and poverty. "You can't trust anyone, Kolochoko. You must marry wisely before your beauty fades, before your options run out." Kolochoko felt herself growing increasingly unsure, torn between the life she imagined for herself and the life Agnes was pushing her toward. She could sense the walls closing in, with the walls of her home becoming prison bars. She had always been told what was best for her, always sheltered from the harsh realities of the outside world. Now, the world was closing in on her. She didn't know how much longer she could stand the pressure, the emotional manipulation, and the constant reminder of the future her stepmother was shaping for her. As Agnes continued to apply her subtle pressures, Kolochoko was left to grapple with the chilling realization that her future may already have been written for her. She couldn't see a way out, at least not yet. The oppressive atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Kolochoko felt like a puppet in the hands of her stepmother, Agnes, whose carefully laid plans were starting to weigh on her like an inescapable chain. Despite her efforts to distance herself from the idea of marrying Elliot, Kolochoko could feel Agnes tightening the noose around her. What started as a quiet pressure was now an overwhelming force she couldn't avoid. But the turning point came unexpectedly, on a cold, quiet evening when Kolochoko stumbled upon a conversation that would shatter the fragile world she had known. It had been a particularly exhausting day. Kolochoko had spent hours in the garden, tending to the flowers and avoiding her stepmother's eyes. Agnes had become more insistent, and the constant tension made Kolochoko uneasy. She had hoped for some peace, some respite from the ever-looming threat of an unwanted marriage. But the moment she walked through the door, she knew something was different. Her father, Harold, had retired to his room earlier that afternoon, his condition worsening as usual, and it was just her and Agnes in the house. Kolochoko, seeking some quiet, walked toward the kitchen, hoping to fetch some water. As she passed the study, she heard voices, low and urgent. One of them was unmistakably Agnes's. The other voice was more distant, muffled, but still recognizable. It was Harold, her father, speaking in his slow, deliberate way. Though his mind had grown frail, Kolochoko knew when he was speaking seriously. She paused by the door, her curiosity pulling her closer. What she heard next sent a chill down her spine. Kolochoko is too young to understand Harold. Agnes's voice was smooth, deceptively calm. She's not capable of managing the estate when you're gone. I've been looking out for her future. This marriage to Elliot will secure it. She'll have a stable life, and we'll have control over the property until she's ready to take it over. We'll be able to guide her, without her knowing. Kolochoko's heart skipped a beat. Agnes wasn't just pushing for a marriage, she was using Elliot as a pawn to take full control of her inheritance. The full extent of the scheme was now clear. Agnes was not planning for Kolochoko's happiness or future. She was using the marriage to keep the family fortune under her thumb. Harold's weak voice followed, sounding unsure. But won't she love him? Agnes chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Kolochoko's spine. Love? It doesn't matter. She's young, Harold. She'll learn to love him, or at least learn to appreciate the life she'll have. I've thought of everything. Once the marriage is done, Kolochoko will have no power to challenge us. It's the perfect solution. There was a brief silence, and then Kolochoko heard Agnes's voice again, softer, but still calculating. It's the only way. You know, this is the best course for all of us. Don't worry about Kolochoko. She'll be fine. She'll come to see that this is the only option. Kolochoko could barely breathe. She wanted to shout, to run into the room and confront her stepmother, but she stayed frozen in place, her heart racing. The realization hit her like a storm. Agnes had planned this all along, the kind words, the promises of a secure future. None of it was for her. It was all a strategy to keep Kolochoko under control and to strip her of her inheritance, reducing her to nothing more than a means to an end. Tears pricked at the corners of Kolochoko's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly, determined not to show weakness. She had to act now. There was no time to waste. Kolochoko had always known that Agnes was cruel and manipulative, but hearing the scheme laid out so plainly was another thing entirely. This was not just a marriage. This was a trap. She needed to confront her father. But when she entered his room later that evening, she found him frail and fragile, lying motionless in his bed. His once commanding presence was reduced to a shadow of the man he had been. His eyes flickered when she spoke, but he couldn't grasp the full weight of what was happening. Despite her best efforts to shake him out of his dazed state, Harold was too weak to respond, his mind clouded by illness. "Father, do you understand?" Kolochoko asked desperately, kneeling by his bedside. "Agnes! She's using me. She wants to marry me off to Elliot to control everything. Everything you've worked for." But her father, unable to fully comprehend her words, merely blinked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and sadness. You must listen to Agnes," he mumbled, barely audible. It was clear that Harold could not help her now. He was no longer capable of standing up to his wife or protecting Kolochoko from the woman who had slowly taken over every part of their lives. Agnes had already won him over, and he could no longer be the ally she needed. But Kolochoko was no longer helpless. Her heart burned with a mix of anger and determination. She would not allow Agnes to strip her of her future. She wouldn't allow the woman who had treated her as a mere tool to control her to win. Kolochoko made a vow that night. She would stop Agnes. She would protect her inheritance, her future and her freedom. But the path ahead would be dangerous, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. Kolochoko knew that this was the moment where she could no longer remain passive. The battle for her future had begun, and there would be no turning back. The weight of Agnes's betrayal was too much for Kolochoko to bear. Every night she lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling with fear, anger, and a fierce determination. She could no longer stay in this house, under Agnes's thumb, waiting for the day her stepmother would force her into a marriage she didn't want, to a man she didn't love. Her only hope now lay in escaping Agnes's control and protecting her future. But escape would not be easy. It would require cunning, timing, and most importantly, a trusted ally. As the days passed, Kolochoko quietly worked on her plan. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, and the only person she could rely on was Elliot. Despite his humble background, Kolochoko had seen something in him that gave her hope, a goodness, a willingness to stand by those he cared about. He might not have had wealth or power, but he had something far more important: the courage to do what was right. The opportunity for Kolochoko to speak with him came when she ventured into the village one late afternoon. She had been avoiding her stepmother's questioning glances and staying in the garden or out on walks, but she knew the time had come. She had to tell Elliot everything. She found him near the village square, unloading sacks of grain from a cart. His strong, weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but he paused when he saw her approach. His face lit up with a warm, innocent smile. The kind of smile that made Kolochoko feel, even for just a moment, that everything might be okay. But the urgency in her heart quickly erased any hint of comfort. "Elliot," Kolochoko called, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." Elliot's brow furrowed with concern as he set the sack down and wiped his hands on his worn trousers. "What is it, Kolochoko? You look troubled." Kolochoko glanced around to make sure no one was listening. The last thing she needed was for anyone to overhear their conversation. She took a deep breath and spoke in a hushed tone. "Elliot, there's no easy way to say this, but you've been deceived. My stepmother, Agnes, she's using you to gain control of my father's inheritance. She plans to marry me off to you, not because she cares for you or me, but to strip me of my future. She wants to keep the estate under her control, and she thinks that if I marry you, I'll have nothing." Elliot's face darkened, the light of confusion giving way to a deep sense of understanding and disbelief. He took a step toward Kolochoko, his hand instinctively reaching out as though to comfort her. "Is that what she's been planning all along?" Elliot asked, his voice low and full of anger. I never understood why she insisted so much on the marriage. I thought it was to help you." Kolochoko nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe she had my best interests at heart. But I know now what she really wants. I can't stay here. She'll force me into that marriage and I'll be powerless to stop it." Elliot looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the situation in his mind. Then, with a resolute expression, he nodded. "I'll help you, Kolochoko. Whatever it takes. If it means leaving everything behind to keep you safe, then so be it." Relief washed over Kolochoko as she realized that, despite the danger, Elliot was willing to stand by her. She could hardly believe it. Elliot, the poor farmer's son, was willing to sacrifice everything for her, and she knew, deep down, that he didn't even fully understand the depth of the danger they were about to face. The plan was simple, but risky. Kolochoko and Elliot would leave the estate under cover of darkness, using a secret path that Kolochoko knew well from her childhood, an old service road that led out of the village and into the forest. Once there, they could escape to the neighbouring town, where Elliot had distant relatives who could hide them until they figured out what to do next. The night they chose to leave, the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the estate. Kolochoko packed only the essentials: a small bundle of clothes, a few pieces of jewellery for trade, and the precious letter from her father that contained the legal claims to her inheritance. Kolochoko waited anxiously in her room, heart pounding as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She knew she was running out of time. Any moment now, Agnes might return to check on her or, worse, discover that she was planning to escape. At last, there was a soft knock at the door. Kolochoko quickly opened it to find Elliot standing there, his face grim but determined. "It's time," he whispered. Together, they made their way down the narrow staircase and out of the back door, careful to avoid any servants who might be awake. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of the trees in the wind and their own footsteps as they hurried through the garden and toward the hidden path. They were almost to the edge of the estate when they heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind them. Agnes had woken up. She had sensed something was wrong. "Kolochoko!" Agnes's voice rang out, sharp and filled with fury. "Where do you think you're going?" Panic surged through Kolochoko's veins as she realized their plan was falling apart. She turned to Elliot, urging him to move faster. But just as they reached the edge of the garden, Agnes appeared in the doorway, her face twisted with rage. She shouted for the servants to stop them. "Don't let them leave!" Agnes screamed, her voice carrying across the estate. "Lock the gates! Lock them all!" Before Kolochoko could react, she felt a cold hand grasp her arm. Agnes had arrived. She pulled Kolochoko back with surprising strength, her fingers digging into her skin. "You think you can run away from me?" Agnes hissed. "I'll make sure you regret this." In the struggle, Elliot tried to reach Kolochoko's side, but Agnes was swift. With a vicious move, Agnes managed to shove Kolochoko into the house, locking the door behind her. Kolochoko's heart raced as she was trapped in her own room, the walls closing in on her. But as Agnes's laughter echoed through the halls, Kolochoko knew this was far from over. She was not going to give up, not now, not when her future was at stake. The walls of the house, which had once seemed so familiar and safe, now felt like a prison to Kolochoko. After the failed escape attempt, she was trapped once again in her room, locked away by Agnes with the unmistakable sound of the door clicking shut behind her. But the fear that gripped Kolochoko was not only for her own future, it was for Elliot, who, she feared, might be caught and punished for helping her. Her thoughts raced as she tried to formulate another escape plan. But there was one thing she knew for certain. This had to end, once and for all. She could no longer run from Agnes, nor could she allow her to control her future. It was then that a voice, weak but firm, reached her ears. "Kolochoko, you need to hear this." It was Harold, her father. His voice came from behind the door, and it was unlike any she had ever heard before. The frailty that had once defined him seemed to have been replaced by a rare clarity, a strength that had been hidden beneath the layers of illness. With a shaking hand, Kolochoko turned the door handle, unsure of what awaited her on the other side. As she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, she saw her father standing at the top of the stairs, supported by a servant, but nevertheless standing tall. There was a fire in his eyes that Kolochoko had not seen in years, and for the first time he looked like the man she remembered, strong, resolute, and defiant. "Father, what's happening?" she whispered, her heart racing. Before Harold could answer, the sharp sound of Agnes's footsteps echoed from behind her. Kolochoko turned to see Agnes storming down the hall, her face contorted with fury. Her hands were clenched into fists, her body tense with rage. She had realized by now that Kolochoko had escaped her grasp, and she was willing to do whatever it took to prevent her from gaining control of her inheritance. "Kolochoko, you've made a grave mistake," Agnes spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can escape me? You think you can take everything I've worked for? You're nothing without me, girl! You'll be ruined!" Kolochoko stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've already ruined everything, Agnes. I've seen through your lies. I've heard your plans. You'll never control me again." Agnes's eyes darkened, and she stepped closer, her words cutting through the air like daggers. "You're too naive to understand. If you take this inheritance, you'll be alone. No one will want you. No one will care. Elliot will leave you just like everyone else, and you'll be left with nothing but a ruined name." Kolochoko didn't flinch. She was no longer the frightened girl who had once obeyed every command. Elliot, despite everything, had shown her what it meant to fight for the truth. She wouldn't back down now. But before Agnes could say another word, Harold's voice rang out with unexpected strength. "Enough, Agnes." The words echoed in the hallway, cutting through the tension like a knife. Kolochoko's eyes widened in shock as she turned to see her father slowly making his way toward them, supported by the servant, but still upright. He looked at Agnes with a gaze that was filled with both disappointment and resolute determination. The frail, sickly man who had once been controlled by Agnes was now standing tall, his voice steady and commanding. "Agnes," Harold continued, his voice more powerful than Kolochoko had ever heard. "I know everything. I've known for a long time. I've been weak, and I've let you manipulate me. But no more. I've seen how you've used my daughter for your own gain, and I will not stand for it any longer." Agnes's face twisted in disbelief and anger, but Harold continued, unshaken. "You have deceived me, and you have deceived Kolochoko. You thought you could take control of everything, my estate, my daughter's future, but you underestimated her. Kolochoko is the rightful heir to this fortune, and I declare it now. She will take control of everything, as it should be. You will have nothing." Agnes recoiled as though struck. Her voice, once so commanding, faltered for the first time. "No, Harold, you can't do this. You can't just turn your back on me." But Harold's resolve was unshakable. "You've manipulated and lied for far too long. You are no longer my wife, and I will have no part in your schemes. Kolochoko is the rightful heir. This estate is hers, not yours." The room seemed to freeze as Kolochoko processed her father's words. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. For so long, she had been living in fear, unsure of whether her father could ever stand up to Agnes. But now, he had finally taken the stand she had always needed him to. Kolochoko turned to face Agnes, who was now trembling with fury. The woman who had once been her stepmother, the woman who had controlled every aspect of her life, was now exposed. Kolochoko felt a rush of empowerment, a fierce triumph that had been building inside her for weeks. She had fought for this moment, and now she was finally free. Agnes's face contorted into a mask of rage and desperation. "You'll regret this, both of you," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "You'll see. I'll make sure you both pay." But Harold remained unmoved, his gaze unwavering. I've already paid for my mistakes. Now, it's time for you to face the consequences of yours." With that, he gestured to the servant who had been standing quietly by his side. The servant stepped forward and handed Agnes a letter, the legal document that would strip her of any claim to the estate. It was official. The inheritance, the property, and the future of the family were now in Kolochoko's hands. Agnes took the letter, her hands shaking with fury. She opened it, her eyes scanning the words. But as the reality of her defeat sank in, she let out a guttural scream of anger. "This isn't over! I'll find a way to get what's mine." But Harold stepped forward once more, his voice cold and final. "It is over, Agnes. This is the end of your game." Kolochoko, standing beside her father, felt a surge of relief and power. For the first time in her life, she was in control. The fight for her inheritance, her freedom, and her future had been long and painful, but she had emerged victorious. Agnes's grip on her life was finally broken. As Agnes stormed out of the house, vowing revenge, Kolochoko turned to her father, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, father," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know if you would ever stand up to her." Harold smiled weakly but warmly. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, Kolochoko. I should have trusted you long ago." And just like that, Kolochoko became the rightful heir to her family's fortune. No longer a pawn in Agnes's cruel game, but a woman with the power to shape her own destiny. The weight of the estate now rested on her shoulders, but it was a weight she was ready to bear. With Elliot by her side, she knew that nothing would stop her from creating the life she deserved. With Agnes's departure and Harold's disownment, Kolochoko found herself at the helm of a new life, a life no longer dictated by fear, manipulation, or the control of others. The weight of the inheritance she had once feared was now a symbol of her strength and independence. Rather than using her newfound wealth for personal luxury, Kolochoko decided to invest in her community, determined to help the village that had always been her home. She used the estate to fund new farming initiatives, helping local farmers, including Elliot, improve their crop yields and secure better livelihoods. Her focus was on building infrastructure, roads, wells, and schools to create a more prosperous future for everyone. Elliot, ever grateful, worked alongside her, his bond with Kolochoko growing stronger as they shared a vision for a better future, not just for themselves, but for the entire village. Though Kolochoko didn't rush into marriage with Elliot, they spent their days building a life based on mutual respect, trust, and love, something she had never experienced before. They worked side by side, their partnership blooming naturally, free from the manipulations of the past. As Kolochoko looked out over the village, the sun setting behind her, she reflected on the journey that had led her to this point. She had faced the worst of betrayal, but now she stood tall and unshaken. The manipulation, the fear, the control, she had broken free from it all. And in doing so, she had discovered the strength within herself to build a future on her own terms. The girl who had once been a pawn in someone else's game had become the woman who now shaped her own destiny.